this stuff, so I have to, I want to spotlight you, right? Okay, there we go.
Thank you, Anne. Welcome, everyone. We're really thrilled to be able to do this course. And as Anne mentioned at the top, I'm also a founding member of the Citizens Alliance of PEI. And that organization was formed after the Stop Plan B highway protests. A lot of people that were involved in that felt that they wanted to continue to work towards advancing environmental rights and the democratic process. So it's a nonpartisan, not-for-profit group of islanders working on that. And the Citizens Alliance is chaired by Chris Ortenberger, and she writes an excellent daily newsletter. So you can sign up by registering online at citizensalliancepei.org. She gives you wonderful information on what's happening on the island and the legislature, and also some wonderful tidbits of information going on around the world. So the Coalition for the Protection of PEI Water was formed in 2013 by the Citizens Alliance when a request was made by a large corporation to lift a moratorium for high capacity wells for irrigation. The moratorium was in place since 2002. And several environmental organizations, watershed groups, farmers, fishers, many individuals came together to press government to maintain the moratorium. Of course, the coalition is a group of different purposes who come together to speak with one voice regarding a major issue. And so it was very easy to get all these organizations together. Well, in a way, easy to get them together, but then we all had to work together to make presentations. And so along with us, there was also presentations made by the Potato Board, the Federation of Agriculture. And after hearing all of these presentations, the Standing Committee on Environment made the decision to recommend maintaining a moratorium on high capacity wells for irrigation. And also from our presentations, we urged them to consider establishing a Water Act for PEI, which they also recommended. So that was back in 2014. The coalition includes over 18 member groups that are involved in environment and social justice, plus many individual members. Most of those member groups made presentations to the Environmental Advisory Committee during the Water Act consultations. One fundamental point was evident with all those presentations. There is a massive public acknowledgement that we have serious environmental problems. Half of all PEI environmental groups were formed since 2000, which is a testament to the urgent need to deal with these problems. And I think on that list today, there's even some missing. The Coalition for the Protection of PEI Land, for instance, has recently been established. So we've witnessed over many years the degradation of our soil organic matter on fields, high nitrate levels in our drinking water, high levels of pesticides, fish kills, anoxic events, siltation, and rivers running dry. Deforestation and overdevelopment on wetlands have also exacerbated the problems. And these problems have not disappeared. In fact, most are getting worse. So in 2015, the Provincial Environmental Advisory Council began public consultations for the Water Act. From July of 2015 to January 2016, they held 46 public consultation sessions, 14 one-on-one consultations with groups and individuals, and received over 400 written submissions. This process was an excellent model for meaningful public engagement. The final report included this statement. It was widely held by many of the participants at meetings across the province that fundamental to any Water Act is the recognition that the protection of the aquatic environment is essential for sustainable water management. Several asserted that the health of the aquatic environment is a key indicator of the quality of all water resources, including the quality and quantity of our groundwater. Consequently, it was suggested that government needs to commit to maintaining and restoring riparian and aquatic environments throughout the province. So the key is that overwhelmingly they were hearing that it's more about protecting the aquatic environment as well as protecting groundwater for future generations. And also, it's not just about figuring out who of us humans has access to it. So from the consultations, 6 key themes emerged: water governance and legislation, water quality, watershed management, environmental flows and ecosystem health, water quantity and conservation, and new approaches to water resource protection. So the Water Act was passed in the legislature in 2017, but there's another step that has to happen, and that's the regulations have to be developed before it can be proclaimed in law. So that should have happened. All the regulations and the consultation should have happened immediately following the passing of the Water Act in the legislature, but it didn't. For whatever reason, and it was stalled for about a year before it was addressed again. So since that time, we have not only a change in government, but overall 5 new ministers of environment. When the consultations on the regulations finally began, they were inadequate by comparison to those of the Act for many reasons. Probably a lot of it was the long timeline waiting for it to happen. There were opportunities to submit comments online, and there were just a few public engagement sessions with multiple choice options for comments. So rather than coming and presenting and having a discussion, there were multiple choices of where you could choose what your priorities were. So nevertheless, though, we do have a Water Act, and it was proclaimed in 2021 for implementation. So you think back in 2017 was when it was first acknowledged in the legislature. But the Act itself represents much of the hard work that the various volunteer groups and individuals committed to, and it is a reflection of most of Islanders' wishes and concerns. Not everyone is completely satisfied, but we felt that we all had our say during the excellent consultation process, and our work was respected and valued and also reflected in the Act. We managed to get a bottled water ban, a ban on fracking, and some other important issues were addressed. But while we were waiting for that Water Act to be proclaimed, so from 2017 to 2021, we were watching all of a sudden a number of holding ponds being dug across the island. Now, holding ponds are not unusual, but it was unusual to see so many suddenly popping up, and some of them very, very large. And our understanding is the holding ponds were being built to get around the high capacity well moratorium, because in the recommendations for the Act, it was recommended to maintain the moratorium. So in order to get around that, several low capacity wells could be used to fill the ponds, equaling the amount of a high capacity well. Now, the coalition was very concerned about this for a lot of reasons, and especially because there was no regulatory body around this. There were no rules regarding how much water is being pumped, how often, any kind of monitoring of the water, where the wells, where the ponds were being built, if it was affecting the watershed. There was nothing. So the coalition met with then Minister of Environment, Natalie Jameson, and urged the minister to put a moratorium on the holding ponds as well. And the minister and the deputy minister, they were very concerned about it. In fact, they didn't even know at that time when we met with them how many were even around. So it was actually a Green Party member who introduced a motion for a moratorium on holding ponds. And the motion was passed. However, it was a non-binding motion. Therefore, it has no authority to move forward into law. So unfortunately, nothing was done. Now, when the regulations were being formed and we had the brief consultation, then it went back to the standing committee, and we thought everything was moving forward with the moratorium staying in place and with the regulations ready to go. And then we heard from now Minister Stephen Myers, Minister number 5, there would be a new irrigation strategy, and that irrigation strategy would allow for the lifting of the moratorium on high capacity wells for irrigation. So this is going to be a new amendment to the regulations. A very brief window was open for the public to submit comments on the strategy paper, and that window closed on December 13th, 2021. So at this point, we're not sure if the irrigation strategy as written will be adopted into the regulations. We assume it will be, and we probably will know that in this spring sitting. So besides the Water Act, the coalition has been involved in many issues regarding water and environment. We made a presentation to the Land Matters Committee recently because, of course, land and water are so intricately tied. We've made many presentations to the Standing Committee on Environment. We met with several ministers of environment covering topics such as pesticides and nitrates in well water in schools, private well water testing, forestry, aquaculture, and agriculture. And we continue to meet and consult with PEI Watershed Alliance, with the East Coast Environmental Law, Blue Dot PEI, and other organizations, and also with several watershed groups and individuals. So that's just a bit of a history. I know I'm sort of covering a lot of things that people already know, but I just thought I'd kind of give you a timeline. And I'm now going to pass things on to Don Mazur.
Thank you, Catherine. Am I supposed to see myself here? Yes. Okay. I'm not very good at Zoom. I'll do my best. Hopefully, we won't be doing this forever. Thank you for the nice introduction. It's great that all you folks are coming out to be able to hear about the work that we've been doing on water. Catherine has described all of that very well. I have to say there's one thing in the introduction about me that isn't really accurate. Although I admire their work, I am not, have never been a card-carrying member of the Institute of Island Studies. Don't know where that one came from. Anyway, so one thing I wanted to highlight in the background information about me was, yeah, I've had a longstanding interest in water issues, and prior to working with the coalition, I was involved in the development of the Winter River Trackety Bay Watershed Association, beginning in 2008 until about 2013 or 14. And the Winter River has become, I think, a real clear example of the issues associated with water extraction and high capacity wells. So the city of Charlottetown has had at that time like 13 high capacity wells on the Winter River, where water was extracted and then pumped to the city of Charlottetown. The Winter River is not part of the watershed in the city of Charlottetown. So it was extracted contrary to flow and 18 million liters of water a day with profound impacts on the watershed. And when we began, nobody was really aware of this. People in the city of Charlottetown had no idea of where their water came from besides the tap, before the tap, and certainly no idea of the impact, the extent of the water extraction and the impact of this extraction. So that became the guiding work of the watershed group, was to make people aware of this and to start to talk about the fundamental issues and to try to be able to have some impact on this unsustainable water extraction that had been taking place for many years. And in fact, I presented at the very first of the Environmental Advisory Committee consultations in the city of Charlottetown, appropriately enough, with a presentation entitled, "We Don't Need Another Winter River." And what that referred to was what even the people in the potato industry were acknowledging as a situation that needed to be avoided. That was a phrase that was used by, I think, someone in the potato industry about recognizing the consequences of that, and that high capacity wells should certainly not create another Winter River. So that interest in high capacity wells certainly is one of the things that I brought to the coalition. So I'm kind of just briefly show you a number of the kind of presentations and submissions we've made over the year. This is just taken from the website, and I would certainly recommend that you look at the website. There's a lot of good stuff. It's not inclusive, but as you can see, over the years, we made a number of presentations on high capacity wells and all around the issue of certainly starting with the issue of the moratorium, which has remained an issue up until this day. So last year, you see that there was a presentation about ending the moratorium. And this was right at the time when, as Catherine referred to, when Minister Mitchell came to office. And after a great deal of discussion about the moratorium and widespread public opposition to ending the moratorium and references to the kind of science that would be needed to produce the data that could help us feel secure about ending the moratorium, Minister Mitchell just announced that we're going to make plans to end the moratorium, and the irrigation strategy was going to be the vehicle for being able to do that. So the irrigation strategy becomes our current decision, but you can see all of these presentations that we made related to high capacity wells, and then a variety of presentations related to the Water Act. Next slide. And some of these are presentations, some are op-eds, some are submissions, but all related to the question of looking at the Water Act, including our consultations with the East Coast Environmental Law Association, who came over and have done some fine workshops for us over the years. And then the next slide, you'll see the presentations we made to the Environmental Advisory Committee itself. Guiding Principles for a PEI Water Act. This is familiar language for us. We also have something that we have submitted called Guiding Principles for an Irrigation Strategy. So we're going to be talking about the key themes that are of concern to the Water Coalition. But you'll see these presentations to the Water Act consultations, the first ones, and then a number of our member groups and individuals that made presentations to the EAC for that process. And then, as Catherine indicated, after that time, this kind of robust consultative process that happened with the first stages of the Water Act dried up, to use a useful metaphor. And by the time we got to the Water Act regulations, there were really no opportunities for public presentations, comments on the department website only. And I believe even some of those didn't even necessarily show who the contributors were, that people were just writing in with their names. I guess they could slip it in there, but the department didn't seem to be particularly interested in that. So I'll just end with one more slide that shows you the kind of work we need to be involved in now because of the fact that the irrigation strategy has become the central vehicle for what's happening with water now, and also the method, I think, where it seems likely that the moratorium for high capacity wells will be lifted, and conditions being laid out for that. We'll talk a little bit more about the irrigation strategy later. Okay, I want to move on, I think, to talk about some of one more comment. We've been involved for a long time with these issues from the beginning. And I think it's telling that the government has never actively sought our opinion or invited us to a consultation or thought to include us in an advisory group, as with the current irrigation strategy discussions. And it certainly raises questions about the role of engaged citizens can be in policy and decision-making. So I want to review some of the themes that have run through much of our work. And you'll find these themes in the writing on irrigation policy, but also in many of other presentations on high capacity wells and Water Act and holding ponds, etc. First and foremost, next slide, please. The coalition has been concerned. Well, we'll skip this and go on to the themes. Thank you. First and foremost, the coalition has been concerned about process, how decisions are made and policies are developed. We are committed to advocating for inclusive processes, ones that provide opportunities for the diverse voices of citizens to be heard, respected, fully considered, and to play a meaningful role in decision making. And we argue for truly meaningful consultation. Consultation is a word that's used frequently, but it is meaningful consultation is something we rarely see in government practices. And we've written about this as well, about what a meaningful consultation looks like. We certainly see it from the early Water Act consultations, but there's lots of other models for how this can be done well. And our aim has always been for citizens and government to have a truly collaborative relationship, one that requires transparency and full access to information. We started talking about the idea of community-based participatory systems of water governance during the Water Act, where citizens would have an ongoing and meaningful role in making decisions about water. Because we're all stakeholders when it comes to water, and we should all be involved in decisions about its allocation, its extraction, and its use. And in fact, we can probably take a fair bit of credit for the fact that the current government discussions about the development of an irrigation strategy are talking about some form of water governance. There's a bit of an irony that this proposal in their discussion emerges from what we could call a top-down management approach to water, where government has handpicked a number of mainly industry groups in the discussions about what form this governance body should take. But then they have also included the Watershed Alliance as a single environmental group. So I guess that's a step in the right direction. But once again, a citizen-based participatory model would be something that would provide participation from a broad spectrum of members of the community. And if you had a chance to look at The Guardian this morning, there was an article about the development of citizens' assemblies, this in relationship to electoral reform. But it's an interesting illustration of bringing a broad body of citizens together to talk about issues that concern them and to use that as a template for moving in the direction of making meaningful decisions. So this participatory models of governance is a challenge for government. They're not used to sharing power with citizens. It is a new idea to them, but one that we need. A second major theme is how we think about our relationship with water and the environment more generally. We need to be mindful that water is a common good and a public trust that supports the life and health of all beings, human and non-human, and not just a resource for humans to use as they wish. And this use of language is very significant for us because of the fact that a resource orientation, and that's the common thing we heard, water is our most precious natural resource. Well, it's not exactly our water. By our, we mean human, and water is there for all to support the life of all living beings. And it's not just something that is there to be used for our purposes. Water, in a sense, is part of an ecosystem. Water has a life of its own, and the environment needs to be not simply used as a source of extraction or exploitation, but to be treated as a respectful entity in its own self. There's a lot of work that's starting to happen about the rights of ecosystems, and I think that there's even a river in Quebec that has been kind of given living status and worthy of the protections that we extend usually only to humans. And we need to recognize that water is not an unlimited. There's not an unlimited supply of water. We need to be thinking about how much water we can leave rather than how much water we can take. Conserving water, minimizing the need for water should be a guiding principle of water policy. But this principle of conservation does not appear as a guiding idea in the Water Act. Now, this idea of conservation really does stand in stark contrast to the message repeatedly delivered by the government and its water bureaucrats and scientists. I even refer to it as a mantra. I hear it so frequently. PEI has plentiful and abundant groundwater for us to use for all of our purposes without endangering the water that supplies our wells and sustains the well-being of the other living beings in the ecosystems. So the message is that we really don't need to be concerned about that because of the fact that we have so much groundwater. And this is, it's interesting. I mean, we're completely dependent upon groundwater. Andrew will talk more about that. But there's a kind of PEI exceptionalism that seems to be happening here as water shortages are present in other places in the world. And, you know, probably California used language like this, you know, 20 years ago, and now they're living with drought conditions and restricting the usage of water for people. But this idea that we're exceptional in this regard, and that we should be able to have access to unlimited supplies of water is decontextualized, shall we say. The other thing is we've always argued that the use of water should be guided by the precautionary principle, you know, that we should, where there's the possibility that a practice is problematic, we should refrain from doing it, and the need for intergenerational equity, that water should be available for many, many generations to come for other living beings. And we are pleased to see some elements of these key ideas included in the Water Act. As Catherine said, there are many good features of the Water Act, and some of the fundamental principles and guiding ideas are among the strongest. A third theme is the importance of an ecological and holistic perspective that is attentive to the interconnectedness of the issues on our land and in our waters, and the interconnectedness of all living systems. This is really important, you know, the way that we look at things. This tendency we have to say, well, there's water issues over here, there's land issues over here. To think in silos is part of the problem, part of the mindset that contributes to the ongoing problems that we have on the water and the land. So it's important to have a ecological perspective that sees that all aspects of life are interconnected in order to be able to really understand and to address these issues. We have had significant problems in our waters for many, many years. Catherine mentioned them, Andrew will mention them. Siltation and erosion, issues that make our rivers run red, high nitrate levels and pesticide contamination that pose threats to human and ecological health, ongoing anoxic conditions that take the oxygen out of water and endanger fish habitat, 62 reported fish kills up to 2020, 51 confirmed as a result of pesticide contamination, and on my own watershed, in the Wind River watershed, major branches of streams drying up every year. And these are also fish kills of a less dramatic nature because you don't see dead fish floating in the water because of the fact that the generations of fish don't happen because of the fact that the habitat for spawning is degraded. So coming back to pesticides in particular and the disconnected thinking, you will find no mention of pesticides in the Water Act, even though they have a tremendous impact on the health of PEI ecosystems. We've been aware of these problems for many years. I had a hand in writing the report that resulted from the watershed consultations in 2006, entitled "We Are All Upstream and We Are All Downstream." And in the conclusion, I described the serious state of the environmental problems that we have at that time and the urgent need for action. But I cribbed a little bit. The words I used were taken directly from the conclusion of the report on the roundtable on the land and water 10 years before, a landmark consultation that had really brought together a very broad group of people from PEI with a range of different interests: agriculture, industry, environmental. and others. So 10 years later, I wrote basically the same conclusion, similar issues, similar sense of urgency. And if you review the submissions to the Water Act consultations in 2015, about 10 years after the watershed consultations, you'll find a very similar assessment about the state of the environment and the same sense of urgency. As Gary Schneider put it so technically and eloquently at that time, things are a mess. The problems we have in our waters are reflective of what we do on the land, and we cannot meaningfully address our water issues without addressing the common practices on the land. And so it's important to recognize that the major practices of our dominant approach to agriculture, with its heavy reliance on chemical fertilizers and pesticides, are at the root of many of our problems with water. The organic content of our soil has been seriously depleted and has been in precipitous decline over many years. Healthy soil can effectively absorb water, enhance the uptake of nitrogen into plants, and reduce its leaching into waterways. These practices also contribute significantly to climate change. Agriculture accounts for 30% of global emissions. Nitrates are a major ingredient of fertilizers and pesticides, and they are the major contributor to emissions through conversion to NO2, a greenhouse gas far more dangerous than CO2. On PEI, half of agriculture's emissions are attributable to fertilizers. The sporadic use of cover crops and the low organic content of our soils are also major contributors. We lack the healthy soils that play a vital role in sequestering carbon. And if I can put in a pitch for another meeting, the annual meeting of the Environmental Coalition of PEI, takes place in a couple of weeks. And the theme that will be addressed there is, in fact, sequestering carbon in our and the role of our land and agriculture, the oceans, and the forests. To meaningfully address climate change and the other issues of water and land, agriculture needs to do things differently and to reduce its dependency on nitrates and pesticides. Regenerative agriculture, agroecology, and organic agriculture are all approaches that can help farmers to make a good living while addressing climate change and enhancing the health of land and water. And we need to find ways of supporting and rewarding farmers in their transition toward alternatives, where they will become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. PEI has not done a very good job in supporting transition from kind of the major forms of largely industrial agriculture that contribute to so many of our problems to the kinds of practices where that are far more sustainable. So most recently, we've become concerned about the development of the irrigation strategies, where many of the issues and the themes that I've discussed are clearly reflected. There are a couple of other things to mention and be aware of is the role that kind of I guess the politicizing of many of these kinds of decisions, because of the fact that many decisions seem to be kind of subject to political considerations or big interests, whether it's big agriculture, whether it's big entities like municipalities seem to have undue influence on the decision making that take place. And we do hear a lot of discussion about the importance of listening to science and listening to experts, and this is extremely important. But it's important to remember that, like the kinds of expertise that is available to us and that we often hear about through the Department of Environment really does come from some of the same water bureaucrats and scientists who have been advising government and advising ministers and making policy over the last 30 years. And these are the same people who have been talking to us about the plentiful and abundant groundwater that PEI has, and not speaking about messages of conservation. So it's important to keep in mind when we hear about science and hear about experts, that sometimes the way that that information is used can be quite selective. But here we are now with the irrigation strategy. This is a really important time. I think it's a time when there could potentially be a turn or a return or restoration or of a truly collaborative process that could involve citizens. It could be a time where we will see systems, truly meaningful systems of collaborative community-based water governance, where we will all have a hand in making decisions about water. It could be a time when the government will decide that it is time to support and reward the kinds of practices on the land, or maybe even require the kinds of practices on the land that contribute to the health and well-being of the environment, and to stop supporting practices that contribute to problems that we have in the land and the water. It could be a time, and should be a time, where everything that we're doing in the water and on the land is part of the solution for addressing climate change, rather than contributing to those problems. So it's an interesting time. I encourage you to keep your eyes on what's happening with the irrigation strategy. And thank you for your time and attention this morning.
Thank you, Don. I'm just going to continue on. This is the sections that Miriam Bowden has sent to us. So I'm going to cover her section and do my best to explain it as we go. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of the Water Act and the regulations. So with any act, of course, it begins with definitions and then purpose statement of purpose and goals. And a lot of our presentations that we made during the Water Act consultations, we really focused a lot on the purpose and goals because they really are supposed to be the lens which the rest of the act follows, so is looking through. So the government maintained that the purpose of the legislation was to protect the island's water resources and ecosystems that support them. And they brought in some of the old Environmental Protection Act legislation into the Water Act. So you'll see some of the purpose here that's listed, and with the goals. And so in A, you'll see for the purpose, the government has a guardianship role to play for the common good, and it really is, it focuses on the principle of sort of common law, water as a common good, and that the Crown has a role to play in protection, but that it's unowned, it's everybody's, and it's also the environment's. B, to maintain an adequate standard of living, everyone needs a sufficient quantity and safe quality. That statement is a modified right to clean drinking water, which is a really quite in-depth right that we are, that the UN actually has a declaration for, if you want to show that slide, and it shows that, oh, maybe it's after all of that, sorry. I had anyway, the UN has a declaration on the right to water. It's not specifically granting that right, but it is, it shows up a lot in international law, but it also is human-centric. So there is actually a motion that's coming forward by the Green Party, I believe, for an environmental bill of rights for PEI, which would also encompass the right to water. C is the renewable but finite resource, and they're talking about sustainability and availability. So sustainability, again, that looks to the longevity. So you're sort of crossing a little bit into intergenerational equity, which is something that Dawn brought up. And every person has a duty to prevent, minimize, and repair harm. So that's another version of a polluter pays principle, which has a longstanding presence in environmental law. And E is a version of the precautionary principle, and we really pressured them to put this in. Again, it's a standard principle in environmental law, and it really it's something that we should always be looking back to when any kind of amendments are happening to regulations, and also when there's any kind of appeals for use of water. So the goals, the present and future generations have sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for domestic purposes. So that covers, again, sustainability, intergenerational equity. So one version of intergenerational equity reads like this. Every generation holds the earth in common with members of the present generation and with other generations past and future. So this principle articulates a concept of fairness among generations in the use and conservation of the environment and its natural resources. And then it goes on to, again, water use be sustainable, not harm water quality, and water security. And then the last one is the public be involved. So this is where we get into public participation and public engagement, and whether it is open, transparent. And so that's another one that we will look back to when we're looking at some of the consultation processes. So it should be any kind of participation we expect to be meaningful. And then we're looking at decisions that are made regarding water, be science-based, that they take into account seasonal conditions, climate change, the need to protect the long-term availability of groundwater, and the security of aquatic ecosystems and the integrity of wetlands. And that's really important that that's there. It's, again, science-based. We need to focus on what's going to be happening with climate change in the future as well. So all of these, they don't have the force of law in and of themselves, but they are contextual value and provide the citizens, government, and the courts with an interpretive tool. So if you are trying to interpret anything going on in the Act, you look back to the principles, purpose, and goals. So we're going into authority and administration. So this is something, again, it sort of covers the powers of the minister. So you'll see a lot of things in the minister may, the minister shall, which will be coming up. I'll be talking a little bit about. But the minister may take the actions that the minister considers necessary in order to manage, protect, or enhance the water resources within the jurisdiction of the province. And you'll see the list of what the minister's responsibilities are. It's interesting that you know, a staggering number of verbs, as Marianne says here. So it outlines the extensive power of the minister in management and protection. So verbs like investigate, inquire, coordinate everyone, prepare policies, standards, guidelines, plan, design, construct, cooperate, maintain, monitor, control quality and allocation, and fortunately, delegate. So the minister controls the allocation of water. He can, for example, adjust or cancel permits for water withdrawals in shortage. He can amend, suspend, revoke, or refuse an approval not in the public interest under the Act, although he must provide reasons for that refusal. This is new, is an interesting one. The minister is to hold water in reserve, which allows for the setting aside of some portion of the available water for the needs of future generations. So if there's a conflict between various water uses and users, priorities for domestic water use and ecosystem health would be placed ahead of industrial and commercial use. But those original priorities are determined by government. So slide 25, please. So now we're into what you would have seen if you're looking at the Water Act on the very top are all the definitions. And so there's a definition of an adverse effect. So that's brought up a lot in the Water Act. And so it's defined as an effect that impairs or damages water resources or changes water resources in a manner that negatively affects related aspects of human or animal health or an aquatic ecosystem. So many of the permitting decisions in the legislation mention that there be an absence of adverse effects, exploration, water use permits, renewals. But the existence of such effects appeared to trump decision-making. If the effects are adverse, then the project, the application is unacceptable. So adverse effects assessed in exploration, extraction, etc. If the purpose is to protect our water resources, such a provision makes sense, especially in the context of our goals and objectives. But the Water Act, it appears to give the minister some discretion to determine whether or not a potential adverse effect is acceptable. So, for example, in subsection 7 of the Act, it states, when deciding whether a proposed activity, matter, or thing should not proceed, the minister and cabinet shall take into consideration such matters as whether the proposed activity, matter, or thing contravenes a policy of the government or the department, whether the location of the proposed activity, matter, or thing is unacceptable, and whether adverse effects that may result from the proposed activity, matter, or thing are unacceptable. So the provision speaks of the minister and the cabinet inquiring whether potential adverse effects are unacceptable. So the necessary implication is that such inquiries will also consider whether potential adverse effects are acceptable. So it makes it very vague. And where the regulations state that the minister may or the minister shall, your ears should prick up. The former is discretionary and the latter is mandatory. So shall, when the minister shall consider certain criteria, it reflects the intentions of the legislative body which passed the act in the first place. More practically speaking, it offers certainty for those applying for ministerial consideration. For the minister, it helps to focus decision-making and provide a degree of confidence in regard to the relevant criteria for decision-making. In the case of may, it's up to the minister. He may or he may not, and in the absence of bad faith, often not much can be done to question based on the minister exercising his or her discretion. So there's no oversight. Next slide, please. So then we have the applications for water withdrawal. So again, we're getting into the mays. So the minister may request tests, data, information, or a plan. He may require an applicant to do any of the following in support of an application. And you'll see the list there. So you must apply for a permit, but the minister only may require data, information, tests. The regulations don't articulate minimum content, which is unhelpful for applicants and unhelpful for government as well, and third parties. So what data, how much data, what is acceptable? What is the regulation stating in that case? And as for drought contingency plans, the acceptability of and a request for any plan is at the discretion of the minister, and then only at the time of application for a permit or reapplication for permit. Next slide, thanks. So there's changes coming into the regulations for the irrigation strategy. And this is quoted in the strategy paper. Larger users of water, including agricultural irrigators, will be required to create a drought contingency plan for their operation. Such a plan will outline how they plan to reduce their water use during extreme drought conditions. There are no details in the draft paper about what would be included in that plan. So we hope that that information will be made public. One more addition to the regs is a soil health improvement plan. So this is a system of soil quality monitoring and improvement called a soil health improvement plan, SHIP, and it'll be piloted for newly irrigated fields and tied to water permitting. So a question to consider, are there sufficient funds to provide the manpower and resources for collecting data, monitoring, and follow-up? So according to the regulations, the minister is the person ultimately responsible for decisions, such as whether or not a groundwater exploration permit or a water withdrawal permit will be issued. In several places, it's stated that decision-making must be consistent with the policies and objectives of the minister. So it's confusing to us. Shouldn't it read that decisions also be consistent with the purpose and goals as stated in Section 2 of the Act? So it's interesting to note that precautionary principle and intergenerational equity are listed here in the Act, but are not listed as principles in the new irrigation strategy paper. I don't know if that actually has any real meaning or bearing on this, but I just looked at that and I realized that they were missing from that. So that's just a really brief overview on the Act and some of the regs and some of the upcoming changes to the regs. We can go a little further into that a little later if you have any questions, and in the breakout rooms as well. But I'd like to pass things on to Andrew.
Thank you, Catherine. Can I have slide 29, please, Anne? Thanks. So I'm going to talk about the past and existing problems with water protection and management, and what work is being done and what can and should be done. And apologies for perhaps going over some of the previous points, but they deserve to be restated. So can we go back, Anne? Thanks. Back one. My name is Andrew Lush. I'm a member of the Coalition for the Protection of PEI Water and a director of the PEI Watershed Alliance, and executive director of the Trout River Environmental Committee, which is, as you can see on the map here, one of 24 watershed groups serving PEI. Watershed groups, if you don't know, I'm sure most of you do, employ students over the summer, employ interns, recent graduates year round, and give them a foot up onto the career ladder. We plant trees and shrubs in the watershed all over the different properties. We do stream restoration. We put up bird boxes. We do bat monitoring. We do shoreline erosion monitoring. We work with landowners and businesses, and they're all community groups led by the community with mostly provincial and federal funding. And I would encourage you to get involved in your local watershed group if you haven't already. And if you just Google the PEI Watershed Alliance, you'll be able to see this map and see contact information for your watershed group. I'm not going to use the term "our" in relation to water or the word "resource," as they both imply, as Don mentioned, a human-centered view of water, while we actually only use 4% of it at the most. So what is a watershed? This is a Hunter Clyde watershed, which I used to work for. It's an exaggerated elevation map of the watershed, which shows you that any rain that hits any area of this land, this is about 26,000 acres, ends up in Rustico Bay. So watershed groups all have more than one watershed in them. Hunter Clyde has 3, Trout River Environmental Committee has 9, and there are over 200 watersheds on PEI. And it depends on how you define a watershed, because you can split it into sub-watersheds and you can just keep going for every single stream. But generally a watershed is a large area of land that opens out into an estuary. A lot of people say we don't have rivers on PEI, we have streams and estuaries, which is probably true. PEI has one underground supply of water, or aquifer, that keeps our streams running all year round and supplies 100% of the water that we use. Unlike other parts of Canada that have lakes or rivers or glaciers providing a supply of fresh water, we rely entirely on that one interconnected underground source. And the aquifer is separated horizontally into very different vertically into different zones, but essentially it's all interconnected. And that is why we have to be so careful not to overpollute or extract our water. And in fact, our aquifer is in the very long term joined up to Cape Breton and New Brunswick, so under the sea. So it's not like we have all these separate sources of water that we can use. And you can see on this slide that I found a pretty good explanation of what an aquifer is. The confining bed is areas that the water takes a long time to go through. And you can see there are water that flows within days of the rain falling and within years into your wells and centuries and even millennia. So the further you go down into the layers of these aquifers, and they're not all like this, the layers are different sizes and angles and different numbers of layers. But basically all the water that hits the ground soaks into the ground and eventually ends up in a well or a river coming up through springs. And that's what keeps our springs flowing through the summer. Unlike municipal water, private wells are not tested. And in most cases, the water is not treated, although home treatment systems can be installed. Chemicals do appear in well water. An estimated 6% or more of private wells have nitrate levels above the 10 milligram per liter level, which is considered unsafe. And if you look at the next page, you can see this is a government website. It's the open data portal on the government website, which has water test data for wells and streams all across the province. So it's very useful information. And you can see here, looking at the Dunk River, for example, over this time scale, the left-hand side is the number of milligrams per liter or parts per million of nitrates in the well water and in a number of sampled wells, an averaged sample. And you can see there's a number of cases there. There's 2, 3, possibly times where that level went over the safe guidelines. And this is like WHO and UN safe guidelines. So we do have a problem. The government data shows that a large number of private wells have pesticides in the water as well. Coliform bacteria can occur in wells because of local problems. All of these issues can be fixed using various in-home treatment systems. And as of January, the government's providing free bacteria, nitrate, and chemistry testing. And you can also filter out pesticides using a cheap under-the-sink filter. We have been pressing for the ministers to put these in schools because there are detectable levels of pesticides in all rural school drinking water. But their response, I think, is that it's because it's under the safe guidelines, then we shouldn't need to put in carbon block filters in schools, but we have disagreed with them on that. In the past, water was managed by a number of different pieces of legislation, as you've heard, and the Water Act has brought these all together into one place. During the development of the Water Act, we saw an introduction of a ban on fracking or hydraulic fracturing, a ban on the export of drinking water as well. In both cases, it took a lot of research by volunteers and public education and many presentations to the government to get these bans included in the Act. And it's a shame that we actually had to do that, that the government didn't do the research themselves. And there are dozens of volunteers across the island providing research to the government, including some of the audience members here today. And it's kind of a shame that we don't have to. I mean, we're passionate about it, and we do the work, but we shouldn't really have to. As you've heard, high-capacity wells were a key issue during the development of the Water Act. Environmental groups had to mobilize back in 2014 to challenge the lifting of the moratorium, which resulted in public pressure for a Water Act to address the regulation of water for irrigation. 8 years later, environmental groups and citizens groups are still holding the government's feet to the flames as the regulation of high-capacity wells has not yet been resolved, as you've heard. In taking so long to enact the Water Act, and with their recent closed-door policy on formulating regulations, the government has lost the confidence of many, and that's a worrying problem. There are a number of factors, going back to watersheds, that have historically had a detrimental effect on the island's water. Water extraction for irrigation reduces the flow of streams, which directly affects the fish, invertebrates, plants, insects, amphibians, and all life in the stream. Fertilizer, natural and artificial, in the water causes sea lettuce and algae to grow in estuaries, choking out the native eelgrass. And this is a picture of the sea lettuce and the areas in which it has choked the streams. The sea lettuce, the eelgrass provides innumerable environmental services, and it's smothered by this sea lettuce. Sea lettuce also causes anoxia, removing all the oxygen from the water and causing extreme stress to fish, and smelly green-gray water, which you may have seen. And now we have a couple of slides elsewhere in this presentation showing that. Our government allows extraction directly from streams, which reduces stream flow to a level which the government admits, and I am quoting, the ecosystem would have a hard time handling. In 2020, the government allowed extraction to even exceed that level. And this is what you can see on the chart here. The red line is the government's mandated low flow level, and the blue line is the actual stream level. So for this whole period in this particular river, the Dunk River, the stream flow was below the legislated level. In 2020, the government allowed it to exceed that level, and many groups, including the Watershed Alliance, reacted strongly against that event and noted that if the government breaks its own rules on water protection, how can we trust that the rules and regulations in the Water Act will be properly enforced? In fact, enforcement's another problem entirely, in that the province does not effectively enforce the many environmental rules that exist right now. And also a lot of the fines and penalties are very low. Pesticide runoff into streams, as we've heard, results in fish kills, which should properly be called river kills, because the fish are the only dead creatures that we see. For example, macroinvertebrates, which are fly larvae that live under the rocks in all streams, flies such as damselflies, dragonflies, caddisflies, these are all essential food for fish, and they're also killed during a river kill. Interestingly, watershed groups can analyze those macroinvertebrates by collecting them from under the rocks. And by looking at the ones that they find, they can find out if there were pesticides in the stream, because the ones that aren't pollution tolerant are killed. So they are actually a good indicator of the health of a stream. And that's one thing that watershed groups do. Over-extraction from rivers near cities, such as Winter River, as we've heard, to the point where the river runs dry, like in this picture here, this is the Winter River, is a real issue, especially as the treated effluent from cities should really be returned to the watershed from where it came, rather than being poured into the sea. Perhaps it should be semi-treated and then returned to a wetland in the Winter River in this case. Farm irrigation wells and irrigation holding ponds have been a major concern for many islanders. Not that irrigation is new or bad, but because it has been up to now entirely unregulated. And a rash of irrigation holding ponds were built in the lead up to the implementation of the Water Act in order to circumvent the regulations. And the government allowed these ponds to be not only built, but also grandfathered in. The debate on irrigation wells is ongoing, as is the debate on whether we should allow irrigation to increase the production of industrial crops that are not part of our food security, but are an exported commodity that many believe is extracting too high a cost on the environment and on our health. As to the future, climate change is going to be a big factor. I like the picture of the house here, the climate change-proofed house that someone has built on stilts. And you see those all over Florida where it floods on a regular basis. This is actually on PEI. There may be more rainfall predicted, but it will be in more severe storms rather than a steady rain that can be absorbed by the ground. This will reduce the recharge of the aquifer and may well increase demand for irrigation. It will definitely increase soil erosion unless we work to increase our soil organic matter, which absorbs and holds water, and make sure there is no bare soil in the winter. Climate change is also going to extend the growing season, potentially meaning a longer season for applying fertilizers and other chemicals. Climate change will alter our mix of tree species, pests, fish, invertebrates, all causing unknown issues for us to tackle in the future. And more pests will survive the winter, possibly meaning a demand for increased pesticide use. Larger fields to accommodate irrigation systems, with the resulting removal of hedgerows, may also worsen these problems. For example, you will have more soil erosion from wind and rain and less wildlife corridors. Population growth, which is something we often, we love to have increased population because of an increased tax base, but of course it means more rural subdivision, more forest clear cutting, and these are all affecting the groundwater and river ecosystems. On the positive side, as we have heard, public engagement during the development of the Water Act was an example of democracy working as it should. Watershed groups have grown in number and capacity over the years. Provincial and federal programs with funds to tackle these issues are increasing year on year. Citizens groups like Don't Fret PEI and our own Coalition for the Protection of PEI Water have advanced the awareness, engagement, and knowledge of the general population and of politicians. We're all much more aware of what we eat and drink and breathe, and there is an increased demand for socially and environmentally responsible and local food. There have been calls for the creation of a public water advisory board with representatives from all water users, including environmental groups, to represent the interests of the rivers and wildlife. And at one meeting, I suggested that as people only use 4% of the water on PEI, perhaps 90%, 96% of the people on that board should be environmental organizations representing the wildlife. Such a board would take a holistic, all-inclusive view of water usage, rather than the current system, which encourages an us versus them attitude to water. Perhaps this approach, allied with the return to proper dialogue with citizens, as happened during the development of the Water Act, would go a long way towards providing a good system for managing water issues. Next slide, thanks, Anne. So the coalition unreservedly supports our farmers. We support the right to clean drinking water for all. We're the first to congratulate the government when they get environmental policy right, but we are concerned that the growth in our dependence on industrial agriculture has too great a cost. We're concerned that our government is not listening to us, to the population, to the experts on issues that affect us all. The coalition and its members will keep on educating, researching, and working to remedy these problems. And if you'd like to get involved, you can go to our website, which is peiwater.com. We noted that there's no contact address on there, but you can contact any of us. I'm sure you can just Google either any of our names, and I think we might put some links up when we finished our presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Whoops. Hello. So thanks, Andrew, Catherine, Dawn, and that's it. Catherine on behalf of Marianne. So I think we're running a little bit behind, but I think it would be really helpful to have a 5-minute break so that everybody can get up and stretch your legs at very least. So we'll do that. It is, let's say we come back at 5 to 11. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So we'll see you all in a few minutes. Okay, so we're recording again. I just want to thank everybody for their presentations. They were amazing. Thank you so much. And we're going to go right into a question and answer period. I can see, Vicki, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask somebody something?
Well, actually, I can't remember if you already said this because that's how my mind works, but if you want to describe what it is we're discussing in our breakout groups, then that might save or stimulate some questions.
Sure. Okay. So the breakout rooms, they're going to be 3. Dawn, Andrew, and Catherine are all going to be in one of them, each going to be in one of them. And they're more general topics as opposed to questions. So Catherine will be talking about public engagement, Andrew about problems and solutions, and Dawn a vision for water. Now, understanding that those broad topics, you can discuss a number of things within them. And so we don't want to sort of stop anybody from raising an issue that's really important to them in those breakout rooms. So there's a lot of scope to talk about various issues, but so public engagement, problems and solutions, and vision for water are going to be the 3 sort of main topics. Yeah. So just having listened to all 3 speakers, and that's an incredibly sort of broad and wide-ranging coverage of water issues and what has been sort of what kinds of processes we've used to have some say in water issues in PEI, and really great description of the Water Act and the process leading up to it. So I'm wondering if there's any comments or questions that anybody would like to make. So Ron, you're asking, okay. Do you want to ask your question yourself, Ron?
Sure. How about talking about categorically how the government is lying to us about our water? And I say categorically because it's anybody who wants to look, it's as basic as checking their references. Their own references contradict what they're saying repeatedly. They are downright lying to us about how much water we have. Don alluded to it earlier. 800 meters of water? Hell no. Even their own references demonstrate that the geological formation is completely impermeable by 200 meters. So I think that's a topic some people might be interested in talking about.
Is there anyone among the panelists who would like to start talking about that?
I'll let Andrew talk, but the one thing I think that they have stated is that there's an abundance of water, but the thing is that not all of it is actually accessible water. That's one point to make, but I'll pass it on to Andrew to cover some more of that.
I was just going to say, Catherine, that obviously all of us can choose the science that supports our arguments. And one of the things that the coalition has been doing is educating our ministers and deputy ministers, as well as the public, on these issues, as was evident by the bottled water part of the Water Act. They weren't even going to consider banning the export of bottled water from PEI until a few of us got together and sat in front of the standing committee and pointed out that if they allowed this company to extract water and bottle it and take it off PEI, they would be opening the floodgates, to use a term phrase, for any company to take as much water as they like. And the government said, well, why is that? And we said, well, it's because of the investor-state dispute mechanisms of international trade agreements, say that you can't use health or environmental laws to stop a company from making money. And that's being used across the country, across the world, to allow extraction to break the law, basically, to break the rules. So one thing we're doing is educating these people. And as I said in my talk, it's a shame that we have to do that, but we have to keep on doing that. And they are coming up with science. They had a speaker from Calgary come over a few years back, and it was, to me, it seemed like sort of grade 2 science that this person was presenting, but the government then latched onto that and put that into their presentation. So we have to hold their feet to the flames. We know that we haven't got the best water experts in the world in the government, and we have to do our best to add to their knowledge. And I think, yeah, that's all I have to say on that.
I'll contribute. I'll offer a couple of remarks about that. And that really has to do with I think what Andrew has pointed out in some of those comments is how the kind of the selective use of science in order to be able to support the arguments and support the cases that the government wants to make. And that's really an important thing to look at. But the other thing is the way in which the government uses information to be able to, I guess, perhaps propaganda isn't too strong of a word, because if you'll look at the government website, I don't know what it's called, it's Straight Talk About Water, or you remember, Catherine? Fast Facts, True Facts About Water, anything. And these are, these are kind of the government readings of things, and the government readings of trying to assure us of the fact that they've been managing everything very well, and we don't really have any significant problems in our water. And the way in which they use them is quite interesting because of the fact that at public consultations, where government's supposed to be there in order to hear what people have to say, they have prominently displayed some of this information for people as they come into the room. Or I don't even remember, maybe back in the Water Act, if they actually talked about some of these things as part of their own introductions to the processes. But here you have, we're supposed to be public processes that are designed so that people can have their say and speak openly. And the government is basically laying out here's the party line in relationship to this. So it does represent, I think, a way in which this kind of information is used. And I'm going to just go back one more thing quickly about this. And it goes back to what Catherine was discussing about adverse effects. And I suppose perhaps it relates to what Ron is saying. The definition of adverse effects is really critical. And as Catherine pointed out, there's a lot of discretion involved in identifying what an adverse effect is. In my history of working on Winter River issues and trying to move government and move the municipality in relationship to that, the fundamental barrier was the fact that nobody in government ever publicly acknowledged that there were problems on the Winter River. So it started just at the very fundamental point of the definition of what an adverse effect is and all the discretion that's involved in being able to identify what that is. So it's fine to talk about that, to have that included in legislation, and even to have some ways in which it's interpreted. But if it's subject to so much discretion that the kinds of problems that we had on the Winter River were not acknowledged by anybody at any level of government as being serious, maybe they started to do it as an afterthought. Then that's kind of a, I don't know if it's a misrepresentation or just a kind of a willful turning away because of the fact that there are other interests there are other interests to be served, and perhaps that's part of the definition. So defining an adverse effect, if it has negative impacts in other realms, which might have to do with like commerce and business or agriculture, then there's going to be reluctance to identify these things as being problems. So that's a bit of a slant on it.
Thanks, Don. Are there any other questions for the panelists or comments people would like to make? Okay, well, maybe we can go right into the rooms then. Sorry. So I think that this is going to happen automatically. If you haven't been in a sort of a breakout room on Zoom, you'll get an invitation in a few seconds to join one, and just click on that, join the room. We'll be talking for 25 minutes or so in those groups. And at about 5 minutes before you're meant to come back, you'll get a message. You'll see a message saying the rooms will close in 5 minutes. You'll get another invitation to rejoin the bigger group, to leave the breakout room. Just click on that. Don't leave the whole meeting though, please. And that should be it. So each room is going to have one of Dawn, Catherine, or Andrew in it. And again, Catherine will be talking about will be facilitating a discussion that could be about public engagement, Andrew about problems and solutions, and Dawn about a vision for water. And we've sort of put you in those rooms randomly, but of course, if there are things that you want to talk about, please do put those on the table at the beginning of your conversation. So unless there are any questions, I'm just going to start now to put you in the rooms. Okay. Actually, before I do that, if anybody is on, I don't think anybody's on a telephone. No. Okay, we're good. All right. So see you in about 25 minutes. Hello. I can't hear you. You're muted. Hi. Hi, Olga. Is that?
Got knocked out here. I have
You
to
got-
be in room
Which room?
1.
Okay. Whoops, there. Okay, I'll try that again. Whoops.
Okay. So yeah, the next point was some of the high capacity well volumes don't bear relation to the actual pumping rates. And I think that was to do with, Ron mentioned that, to do with testing the wells for the, the potential rate that they can pump at doesn't bear relation to the rate that they can actually be pumped at. We put that as a problem. Future population growth, of course, means that we're going to be using more and more water as the population of PEI and the rest of the world keeps growing. Saltwater contamination not being taken seriously enough by the government was brought up. And one of our groups said he has a deep anxiety about water issues and that PEI should be a leader in sustainable development. And the last 2 points were forestry, problems with forestry, allowing clear cutting, still planting white spruce, even though they're possibly all going to be dead by the end of the century or even sooner. And yeah, the fact that we've got to plant 2 billion trees across the country. And that obviously bears relation to water in the fact that some trees are better at storing water and solving problems with watersheds than other ones. And yeah, I mentioned that you're allowed to clear cut to within 15 meters of a stream on a hill, and that happened in a place in our watershed, which resulted in the remaining trees blowing down and the water running red. So that's not good. The Holland College Watershed Center of Excellence was mentioned, and it was very encouraging that that center is being formed. And that was our final point. Thank you, Anne.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Catherine, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Anne. Great points. Sounds like you had a good, fulsome talk. So yeah, we were talking about public engagement. We kind of sort of did a whole scope of things too. One of the things that was brought up is that conservation is really important, but how do you bring the public into that conversation when it seems to be lots of water and we consume as much as we need? We don't seem to see the issue in front of us. So it's hard to educate that way, but education was brought up as a real key. Something that we do need, and the center was mentioned as well, the Holland College Center, and also just education in the public in a less informal way as well. Needing to think about the future, and that's the thing with the population here, is that we have a lot of people moving to the island too. I didn't bring this up in the conversation, but just made me think of that letting people understand what we have here and what is so precious, but also thinking about what we're leaving behind. One suggestion was a way to really poll the populace on issues for government to address at the time of voting. So when you're getting to elections, really have an idea of the issues and educate people on those issues, and expanding that education. And then we got into a really interesting thing as far as engagement about art and how art can play a role and has played a role on the island in educating people about environmental issues and things like art in the open and the Clyde River, but also there's been a recent project with artists, visual artists working on projects to see the effects of climate change and erosion. And I think that's a really great way to tap into a population and try and connect with them about some of the issues. It's just then the trick is turning that into policy, into legislation, but at least makes people aware, and then maybe they have a desire to get more involved and to get engaged.
Thanks, Catherine. John. You're okay. You're not muted. Oh, no, you are. Sorry, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
All right. Okay, some of the themes that were mentioned, we certainly had mention of the question of access to good data about how much of water actually is used in the process of irrigation, and trying to be able to get good data on water use, and the kind of question about how much we get from the presentation on the government website, for example, like On the Level and other sources of that kind of data. We had the point was certainly raised, also concerning, I guess, education, that there seems to be a disconnection between folks who have a good understanding or a better understanding of issues happening with water, and the need for the trying to encourage more of the public to catch up with that, and how to get more of the public on board with the kind of issues we're talking about here. We had a question raised, acknowledging how big industrial agriculture is on PEI, and it's very difficult to be able to turn that around and try to encourage regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, etc. And the question was raised about how we can work with big scale farmers and the importance of that. So certainly, while the kind of problems from industrial agriculture on water quality were clearly acknowledged, we had a lot of comments that were related to the impact of residential development and the kind of rapid increase in residential development, particularly in rural areas, and all of the new wells that were being dug, and the impact that they would have on water quantity, but also some issues with what people were doing on their land, deforestation concerns with new development, where people were not paying attention to buffer zone restrictions and cutting down their trees so that they could have a better view of the water, and then apparently paying a penalty afterwards. And so the idea that that development is playing a larger role, in addition to considering the agricultural factors, which are very large, that we have to think about development, we have to think about tourism, we have to think about all the other kinds of practices that are having impact on our water, and the fact that we don't really have any kind of a good long-term vision, or haven't tried to think about a vision of land use, for example, of what things will be like that's more suitable to the present time. I guess we, recently had those consultations about kind of closing loopholes, but that's something different from a larger vision of land use, especially with the tremendous population increase that we're having, PEI being the fastest growing province in Canada. So those were the major issues that came up in our discussion.
Thanks, Don. So, sorry, I thought I removed your spotlight. Okay. So I'm wondering now if we have 15 to 20 minutes left, I think, if 15 minutes. So the floor is open to anybody who is interested in asking another question or making a point or commenting on or following up on the discussion. And I think actually, Catherine, you mentioned Pierre might be.
Yes, Pierre, did you want to finish your thought there? I'm sorry, I didn't include that when I was talking.
Okay, I just unmuted myself, figuratively speaking. Yeah, so the Science Center, it's something we've been trying to get going for 3 to 4 years. The Bedeque Bay Watershed Group is involved with our group on that. And the bigger stumbling block is finances, as usual. And but we're still ongoing. We've made one attempt and trying to secure funding to get the thing rolling. And we're reapplying this year again for it. So enthusiasm is there on the part of the organizing group. It's the Science Center would be a good vehicle for the children to develop. Like, we need doctors and nurses, and that's where you can inspire young minds. It's where you can expose things like watersheds, where you can expose water use and misuse. So that's a mainstream of endeavor of this particular group. Like I said, I live opposite the Punch Bowl, and we like to go in there for walks, and there's all kinds of streams and wood recreation of the forest, and so it's very interesting, and it's a very popular area. So I just want to attract the attention to the Science Center group that's trying to get something going on that score, which would be in the line of stimulating discussions and developing minds. That's it for me.
Thank you. And Devil's Punch Bowl is in the Trout River watershed, I believe.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for that. That's an interesting, I didn't realize that was something that the Bedeque BEMA had been working on for so many years.
Yeah.
Is there anything else anybody would like to add to the conversation?
I'd like to add, if I can, Anne, about enforcement. I mentioned in our group that a hillside had been clear cut to within 15 meters of the stream, and then all the rest of the trees had blown down. In fact, they went to within the buffer zone, so they went under the 15 meters, and they got the province out there to have a look, and they just got a warning. So that just shows you what kind of penalties there are for environmental infractions. The previous time they did that, they got a $3,000 fine, which, if you're clear cutting 100 acres, is just the cost of doing business. And I'm afraid that's the way it is in a lot of cases.
When there was recently a survey put out to contractors, to people on the island who would normally be expected to control that runoff. And one of the big reasons they gave for not doing it, or that they were not happy about doing it, was that it was cost prohibitive. But another very significant bunch of feedback was that it was not being implemented, it was not being enforced. So if you're a company and you're looking at a cost that's pretty significant, but it's not being enforced, and your competitors are not doing it, and they're undercutting you, then you're not going to do it. So yes, enforcement has to be there, and the penalties have to be severe enough that it's just a cost of doing business, and you can't afford to not respect it. At the moment, it's not enforced, so why the hell do it?
Thank you, Ron. Okay, so what I'm hearing, it sounds like people are really sort of interested in getting more information and more transparency on the part of government around some of the information they're using, and also the decision and how they're using it in their decision making.
Yeah.
There's, Yeah, and I think that one theme that I've sort of heard each of the presenters address would be around having meaningful opportunities for meaningful participation, whether that's in the consultation process when policy is being developed, or whether it's in water governance model. And then also, as you just spoke to, I think around penalties or repercussions when harmful actions are taken, sort of how do we treat those? How do we make sure it doesn't happen again? How do we enforce the rules that we have? And then the education, the sort of the need to engage more, to share information, I guess. And I love the idea of using art to do that. I think the current exhibit is at the Uptech Center in Summerside that features a number of island artists, and they're sort of dealing with the climate change in their art. Okay, is there anything else that people would like to say, or any of the panelists? Would you like to wrap up? We're getting close to noon.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for coming and staying. It was a long morning, a lot to take in. But we really appreciate that there was interest. I know there were some people that couldn't be on this, and that's why we're recording it, because there was another course happening at the same time. So we'll make sure that they get a chance to see it. I really encourage everyone to get involved, whether it's with your local watershed or any of the organizations that we've mentioned, even the coalition or the Citizens Alliance. There's so many wonderful nonprofit organizations that you can volunteer with. And I do think there are still some positives. I know we pointed out a lot of real negative things that are going on, but we do have a Water Act, and there are some strengths in that there is some legislation now around some of the things we were concerned about. Yes, of course, it could be stronger, and of course, we need to see it enforced. But we're moving forward, hopefully in a more positive way. There are now, there's talk about the Water Governance Board, which would be really a wonderful thing to see, that hopefully will produce a more collaborative approach to water. We're seeing other things happening in other areas, like a citizens assembly for electoral reform. So there's some positive things happening around public engagement, which I'm excited about. And we just have to keep encouraging government to move in that direction.
Thanks, Catherine.
And very strongly encouraging government in a sense. Yeah, I echo what Catherine's saying, in my moments of being discouraged and one of observation that, we've said made the same good arguments over and over and over again so many times, and often it feels like without much of an impact. But I think probably that really isn't true. When we take a look at the content of the Water Act, take a look at some of those key guiding principles that are there, that probably without the vigilant engagement of citizens, that they wouldn't be there. And lots of other stuff is absent. But it is an uphill battle, and that simply the process of raising good arguments is not sufficient to be able to create change. If people have any really good ideas about what creates change, I'd love to hear them, because I'm really not clear on what creates change myself. So I think that, people getting involved in whatever way they can, those of you who are more inclined toward moving in political directions and letting, people who are engaged in government know how you feel about these issues and what you think needs to happen. All of that stuff is great. Public voices being heard is excellent, or joining with us, and everybody seeking to find ways in their own lives that they can move this forward. They say that, maybe I said this did I say here in the breakout room, that like George Monbiot said, that like 20 in regard to climate change, the critical mass for creating change is like 25% of the population. So the idea of moving in that kind of direction, engaging citizens, maybe we don't know what we'll do when we get all those citizens engaged, but if we get enough citizens engaged, then we can have a powerful impact. Hopefully.
Yeah, that 25% is Pareto's law. Pareto's law is 20. You get 80% of your result from 20% of the actors.
Pareto's law.
Mhm.
I don't know. Pareto's law. I don't know.
Pareto, Pareto, Pareto's law, and it applies in biology and stats and all over the place. So yeah, a relatively small group of people can have a really big impact. But I'm wondering if any of us have big trucks that have really loud horns.
That's
funny.
Okay, thanks. Andrew, did you have anything to say?
Well, I had to back up exactly what Don said there, and also to encourage everyone to become a member of the local watershed group, even if it's just a $10 a year membership. That's what makes the government sit up and listen when there are people involved in watershed groups. And the watershed groups are taking on a larger and larger load every year. The number of staff is going up, the number of things we have to do is going up, which is kind of a shame, because in a way it would be great if watershed groups could do themselves out of business and not be needed. But here we are having to fix more and more problems, probably as we're identifying more and more problems, as much as more and more problems actually occurring. But I think it's very encouraging that the government is using these community groups, because that's what they are, which basically didn't exist 30 years ago, apart from a few of them, to get boots on the ground very efficiently and to educate children. Education is a large part of what the groups do. Educate the staff that we have, get them jobs in environmental companies and the government. So I would very much encourage you, and I put up the link there in the chat for the PEI Watershed Alliance. And if you go there, you can see what your local watershed group is. And yes, please do sign up. Thank you.
Thanks. And let's just not let our watershed groups turn into Trojan horses. So anyway,
Thanks, Ron. I think just from my years of being involved in my local watershed group, I would say that, add to what Andrew said, just that it's the beauty of watershed groups is that they're so local. I mean, they're really based in the watershed. They engage people in the watershed to sort of understand the importance of the watershed and I think the beauty of it too. You know, all the work that you do around engaging children and also around highlighting natural features in the watershed. I think that's how we get people involved, by making it something that they learn to love, or loved in the first place. Okay, so I think that's it for today. And I also want to thank everybody for coming and sticking with it and taking part in the discussions.
And thank you for leading the discussions, Anne. You did a great job.
Yes, thank you, Anne.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you, panelists. Everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.